Yo, what is going on, everyone? Today we have another Rick and Morty video. Hope you guys enjoyed this one. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and watch till the end.
Close your eyes for a moment. Or don't. Either way, it doesn't matter. Not in the cosmic sense, not in the way that keeps the planet spinning or the stars from burning out. The universe will do whatever it was going to do regardless of whether your eyes are open or shut. That's kind of the point. That's actually, if you want to get into it, one of the first things Rick Sanchez would ever tell you. Welcome. Welcome to this video, to this quiet little corner of the internet that we've carved out together, where the lights are low and the ideas are big, and the whole point is to let something wash over you. Tonight, or this morning, or whatever hour it is when you find yourself here, we're going to sit with one of the most philosophically layered characters that modern television has ever accidentally produced. A genius, a drunk, and a grandfather, a grieving man with a portal gun, and absolutely nowhere left to run. Rick Sanchez from Rick and Morty, the animated series created by Dan Harmon and Justin Roiland that premiered on Adult Swim in December of 2013, and somehow quietly became one of the most philosophically rich shows that mainstream television has produced in decades. Now, I want to be careful about how I say that because I know how it sounds. I know the reputation that certain corners of the internet built around this show. The memes, the Szechuan sauce frenzy, the occasionally unbearable fandom discourse. But underneath all of that, underneath every absurd joke and every dimensional catastrophe, there is a show that is genuinely wrestling with some of the oldest and most haunting questions that human beings have ever asked. Questions about meaning. Questions about grief. Questions about whether love is real or just chemistry. Questions about whether the fact that the universe doesn't care about you is terrifying, or whether it's actually, somehow, the most liberating thing you've ever heard. Rick Sanchez is the vehicle for almost all of those questions. He carries them the way some people carry old injuries. Not always visibly, not always loudly, but in every step and every decision and every seemingly careless thing he does that is, upon closer inspection, not careless at all. Not even slightly. So tonight, we're going to sit with him. We're going to go slow. We're going to start at the beginning of his philosophical world and walk through it gently, the way you walk through a house you grew up in long after everyone has moved out. Some rooms will be familiar. Some will feel colder than you expected. And some will open up into spaces you didn't know were there. I want you to get comfortable. If you're lying down, settle in. If you're sitting up, let your shoulders drop. There is no rush. There is absolutely nowhere you have to be right now. The universe, as Rick would be the first to remind you, neither knows nor cares about your schedule. So for the length of this video, neither do we. Here's the thing about philosophy that most people don't tell you when they first encounter it. It isn't a set of answers. It's a set of questions that have been asked so many times by so many people across so many centuries that the asking itself has become a kind of art form. The asking has texture. The asking has weight. And the reason Rick Sanchez resonates so deeply with so many people, on across so many different kinds of lives and circumstances, is that he is one of the most honest askers we've ever seen in popular fiction. He doesn't dress the questions up. He doesn't make them pretty. He takes the fact that nothing means anything, and he holds it up in front of you with both hands and dares you to look at it directly. Most people, when they encounter that kind of stare down with meaninglessness, look away. Rick doesn't. That's the whole thing. That is the engine that runs his entire character. And once you understand that, once you really sit with what it means to be a person who has looked directly at the void and not flinched, everything else about him, the drinking, the cruelty, the love he refuses to name, the family he can't quite leave, all of it falls into place. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Oh, that's a bad habit. Tonight we're going slow. Tonight we let the ideas come to us. The show that Rick inhabits is one that critics and academics have spent years picking apart, and with good reason. It draws from a lineage of philosophical thought that stretches back centuries. It pulls from the cosmic horror tradition pioneered by H.P. Lovecraft, who wrote in the early 20th century about the existential terror of a universe indifferent to human existence, who described ordinary life as, and this is a phrase that might ring a certain kind of bell, a thin shell over a reality so alien and abstract that contemplating it could damage the sanity of an ordinary person. Rick is not an ordinary person. Rick has contemplated it directly for decades. with the full force of the greatest scientific mind in the known multiverse. And the result is a man who is, in almost every measurable sense, profoundly broken, and yet somehow still here. That tension, the tension between knowing too much and still choosing to stay, is what we're going to explore tonight. It's going to take us through nihilism and absurdism, through grief and love and the strange paradox of a person who says nothing matters, and then, quietly, stakes everything on the things that do. It's going to take us through cowardice dressed up as brilliance, and through the kind of courage that doesn't look like courage at all from the outside. It's going to be a long walk, but there's no hurry. The rock will still be at the bottom of the mountain when we get there. Let's begin. Here is a thought I want you to carry at the beginning of our walk tonight. The show was created by two people, Dan Harmon and Justin Roiland, who, by their own admission, were not trying to make a philosophy program. Harmon has talked openly about his depression, about his difficult relationships, about the experience of building something brilliant and then sabotaging it. Roiland has spoken about using absurdist humor as a way of processing a world that often feels inexplicable. Neither of them sat down and said, "Let us create an animated vehicle for Nietzsche and Camus." But what they did was sit down with their full, complicated, troubled human selves. And the result was a show that keeps accidentally, or perhaps not accidentally at all, arriving at the questions those philosophers spent their lives on. This is how philosophy actually works, more often than the textbooks suggest. It doesn't always start with Plato and work its way forward. Sometimes it starts with a specific kind of pain, or a specific kind of wondering, or a specific experience of the world not behaving the way you were promised it would, and it works its way outward from there. Rick Sanchez was built from that kind of pain. The pain of knowing too much and feeling too much and having no comfortable place to put either of those things. We are going to be spending a lot of time tonight in uncomfortable places. Not in an unpleasant way. The whole point is to visit them slowly, quietly, to sit in them long enough to notice what is there. Because the uncomfortable places in Rick's philosophy are the same uncomfortable places that most people carry around with them. Now, the places where the official story about meaning and purpose and the way things work starts to show its cracks. The places where you look at the size of the universe and feel very briefly, but very clearly, that you may have been oversold on your own importance. Rick feels that all the time. Rick has been feeling it for decades. And the question the show asks over and over is not whether that feeling is correct. It probably is, or at least the show never seriously argues otherwise. But what you do with it, how you live inside it, whether you let it hollow you out, or whether you find in the very fullness of the emptiness something worth building a life around. That is the question we are taking on a walk tonight. So let your breathing slow. Let the weight of the day settle somewhere it can rest. But let the thoughts that need to be quiet go quiet. There is nothing you need to decide right now. There is no problem you are supposed to be solving. There is just this video and these ideas and the very ordinary miracle of being a conscious creature in an indifferent universe, choosing to spend some time thinking about one of the most honestly drawn characters that animated television has ever produced. Let's begin from the beginning. Let's go back before the portal gun and the citadel and the multiverse. Let's go back to a garage in Dimension C-137, where a man named Rick Sanchez once built something from scratch and loved something without reservation and had not yet discovered how temporary everything was going to be. Let's go back to before he knew. Section 2. The man behind the flask. Who is Rick Sanchez? Before we can explore what Rick Sanchez believes about the universe, we need to spend some time with who Rick Sanchez actually is. Not the persona, not the swaggering, belching, occasionally homicidal genius, but the person underneath. The version of Rick that existed before the portal gun and the Galactic Federation and the infinite corridors of the multiverse. The version of Rick that once made a choice that changed everything and has spent every day since then living inside the consequences of that choice without ever quite admitting he made it. Rick Sanchez, designated C-137 by the show's internal mythology, was not always the man we meet when the series begins. The show takes a long time to give us his full origin, parceling out the details across multiple seasons and fragments and flashbacks and unreliable memories. But by the time the full picture assembles itself, It reveals something deeply, almost unbearably human beneath all the science fiction architecture. He was once a scientist, not an interdimensional traveler, not a rogue genius living outside the laws of physics and society, just a scientist. A man working in his garage trying to crack the mathematics of teleportation, who had married a woman named Diane and had a daughter with her named Beth. The show tells us that their marriage, at least in that early chapter, was a good one. Not a fairy tale good, not a perfect good, but the kind of good that exists in real relationships. The everyday warmth of two people who chose each other and meant it. Diane supported Rick's work, as she believed in him. And based on everything the show reveals, Rick loved her in the way that some people only ever love one person. Deeply, organically, in the kind of way that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't feel the need to. It was just there, it was just the fact of his life. And then another version of Rick showed up. Another Rick Sanchez from another dimension, who had already solved the problem that C-137 Rick was still working on. This other Rick, the one the show eventually names Rick Prime, came through a prototype portal with an offer. Join our network, travel the multiverse, abandon the ordinary life you've built. Our Rick said no. He wasn't interested. He had something he didn't want to give up. Rick Prime, insulted by the refusal, sent a bomb through a portal into Rick's garage. It killed Diane. And it killed Beth. It took in an instant everything that Rick had built and loved. And it did it simply because another version of himself decided that love and domesticity were weaknesses unworthy of the name Sanchez. The grief that followed is the thing that made Rick who he is. Not the intelligence. He had that before. Not the invention of the portal gun, Baba, that came after as a direct consequence of what he lost, as the instrument of his hunt for revenge. The grief is the load-bearing element. Everything else was built on top of it, or built to cover it, or built to give it somewhere to go when it became too heavy to carry in place. When we finally meet Rick, he has been living with this for decades. He invented portal technology. He fought in a war against the Galactic Federation alongside Birdperson and Squanchy. Yet he killed alternate versions of himself across the multiverse in his search for the Rick responsible for Diane's death. He eventually helped found the Citadel of Ricks, a civilization built from his own reflection and one he came to despise. He spent years in a kind of purposeless drift before finally showing up at the door of a living version of Beth. Not his Beth, who died in C-137 with Diane, but a Beth from another dimension who grew up without a father. Rick moved into her house, befriended her son Morty, and the show begins. All of this matters because it tells us something essential. Rick is not a nihilist because he was born that way. He is a nihilist because he was made one. There is a difference, and it is important. Born nihilism is a philosophical position chosen at leisure, but made nihilism is a wound that philosophized itself into a worldview because the alternative, admitting how much you loved something and how completely it was taken from you, is simply too much to bear on a regular basis. Rick's philosophy is his scar tissue. That's the first thing to understand about him. Before we can evaluate what he believes, before we can hold his nihilism up to the light and see what it's made of, we have to understand where it came from. We have to understand that it did not begin as a philosophical conclusion. It began as a survival mechanism. It began as the only available response to a wound that was too large to keep calling by its right name. This is not unique to Rick. The history of philosophy is full of people who turned their personal catastrophe into a worldview. Schopenhauer, who wrote so eloquently about the fundamental suffering of existence, lost his father to suicide when he was 17 and spent years in a difficult relationship with a mother who wanted him gone. Kierkegaard's engagement collapsed, and the experience of public humiliation and private grief shaped his entire subsequent thinking about despair. Nietzsche spent the last 11 years of his life in mental collapse, unable to write, possibly aware on some level that the philosophy he had built around the value of suffering had reached its natural limit in his own body. The great philosophers are not detached observers. They are people who were hurt and who thought very hard about the hurt and came out the other side with something that was both deeply personal and somehow universal. Rick is in that tradition, and he is hurt in a specific and irreversible way, and he has built a specific and irreversible philosophy around that hurt, And the philosophy says things that feel true at a cosmic level, even though they grew from something very personal and very particular. That's not a diminishment. That's how the best thinking actually works. The second thing to understand is that the scar tissue is very, very thick by the time we meet him. Thick enough to pass for personality. Thick enough that Rick himself, on most days, has convinced himself that this is just who he is. A man who knows the universe is meaningless and has made peace with that knowledge by deciding not to care. But the show keeps pulling the curtain back. It keeps showing us the moments when the scar tissue isn't quite enough. The moments when something slips through. Us in those moments are some of the most quietly devastating things you will ever watch in an animated series about a drunk scientist and his nervous grandson. Rick is, at his core, a tragic figure in the classical sense. Not tragic in the modern, watered-down sense of unfortunate. Tragic in the ancient Greek sense, a person of exceptional nature, capable of extraordinary things, brought low by a flaw that is inseparable from the very qualities that make them great. Rick's intelligence is simultaneously his greatest gift and the source of his most profound suffering. His capacity to understand the universe perfectly is what prevents him from being comforted by the simplifications that comfort most people. And his capacity for love, which runs deep, regardless of how rarely he lets it show, is what makes every loss more devastating than it would be for someone who held the world more lightly. He is a man trapped between what he knows and what he feels. He knows, with scientific certainty, that love is a chemical reaction. He feels with devastating completeness that it is the only thing that has ever mattered to him. That's Rick Sanchez. That's the person underneath the lab coat and the flask and the permanent semi-drunk slur in his speech. A man in immense, largely unspoken pain, who built a philosophy out of that pain so he wouldn't have to call it what it is. Now, let's explore what he built. Section 3. Nihilism and the nothingness that moves. Rick Sanchez is, in almost every meaningful way, a nihilist, not a casual nihilist. So not someone who adopted the label for its aesthetic appeal the way teenagers in black turtlenecks sometimes do, but a genuine, full-spectrum, philosophically consistent nihilist. Someone who has reached the conclusion that life has no inherent meaning, that the universe is indifferent to human existence, that moral codes are social constructs without cosmic backing, and that the religious and cultural frameworks people use to avoid these conclusions are, at best, comforting fictions, and, at worst, elaborate self-deceptions. The word nihilism comes from the Latin nihil, meaning nothing. As a philosophy, it emerged most prominently through the work of Friedrich Nietzsche in the 19th century. Though Nietzsche himself was less a proponent of nihilism than a diagnostician of it, someone who identified it as the inevitable consequence of the death of God and the rise of scientific materialism, and who was more concerned with what comes after nihilism than with nihilism itself. Nietzsche famously announced that God is dead, by which he meant not that a divine being had physically perished, but that the belief system built around the divine had lost its grip on Western culture, and that nothing had yet been found to replace it. The result, he argued, would be a creeping emptiness, a loss of the shared values and frameworks that had previously given human life its sense of purpose and direction. Rick Sanchez is what happens when that creeping emptiness finishes its work. Should he, as Nietzsche's diagnosis, made flesh and given a portal gun. The show makes Rick's nihilism explicit in ways that are sometimes funny and sometimes not at all. In one of the show's most quoted moments, the 14-year-old Morty tells his sister Summer, "Nobody exists on purpose. Nobody belongs anywhere. Everybody's gonna die. Come watch TV." This is not Morty's original thought. It comes directly from Rick's worldview, absorbed through years of exposure to his grandfather's philosophy. And the fact that it comes out of a 14-year-old's mouth, delivered as comfort, as the answer to Summer's existential distress, is both hilarious and genuinely haunting. It's the kind of line that sounds like nothing, and then, if you let it sit, opens up into something enormous. Rick himself is more explicit. In scattered moments across the show, yet he tells Morty that love is a chemical reaction that compels animals to breed. He dismisses morality as something stupid people invented to control each other. He observes, during one cosmic adventure or another, that the universe is basically an animal, that it grazes on the ordinary and creates infinite idiots just to eat them. These aren't throwaway lines. They're the consistent expression of a coherent worldview, one that Rick has held for a very long time, and that has shaped every decision he has made in his adult life. But here's where we need to be careful, and here's where Rick's philosophy becomes more interesting than simple nihilism. Nietzsche himself distinguished between two kinds of nihilism. There is passive nihilism, what Nietzsche called the decline and recession of the power of the spirit. Now, the kind of nihilism that leads to despair, to withdrawal, to the simple giving up that happens when someone looks at the meaningless universe and concludes that there's no point in doing anything at all. And there is active nihilism, the kind that looks at the same meaningless universe and responds with energy, with creation, with the deliberate construction of new values to replace the ones that crumbled. Nietzsche preferred the active kind. He thought passive nihilism was a kind of spiritual cowardice. Rick occupies an uncomfortable middle space between the two. He is not passive in the traditional sense. His whole existence is kinetic, purposeful, explosive with action and invention and the relentless pushing of boundaries. He creates constantly. He destroys constantly. That he moves through dimensions and galaxies with the confidence of someone who has long since stopped being impressed by the scale of the universe. That's all very active. And yet he is also not fully the active nihilist that Nietzsche had in mind, because Rick has not replaced the old values with new ones. He has instead replaced them with nothing, or at least he tells himself he has. He tells himself he values nothing, that nothing matters, that every dimension is disposable and every relationship is replaceable and every adventure is ultimately just killing time until the end of something. But the show keeps demonstrating again and again that this is not actually true. Rick's actions contradict his stated philosophy with remarkable consistency. He risks himself for Morty, or he burns entire civilizations to the ground to protect Summer. He spends decades hunting across the multiverse for the version of himself who killed his wife, which is not the behavior of someone who genuinely believes that love is just a chemical reaction, and loss is just the natural consequence of attachment that never meant anything real. You do not dedicate half a lifetime to avenging someone whose death you consider philosophically inconsequential. There is a word for the gap between what Rick says and what Rick does. That word is grief. And grief is, in a certain philosophical sense, the purest proof that something mattered. You cannot grieve nothing. The very fact of grief is evidence of value, of meaning, of the kind of love that exists below the level of articulation, and doesn't care what your stated philosophical position is. Rick knows this. On some level, behind all the layering of nihilism and sarcasm and strategic intoxication, Rick knows that his philosophy is a lie he tells himself to make the truth bearable. And that awareness, the awareness of his own performance, the knowledge that he built this worldview as armor rather than discovering it as fact, is what makes him a more compelling figure than a simple nihilist could ever be. Nietzsche also wrote about the Übermensch, the overman, the figure who creates new values in the ruins of the old ones and lives by them with full commitment. There's a reading of Rick Sanchez in which he is a failed Übermensch, someone who has all the intellectual capacity to create new values and new meaning, but who can't quite make himself do it, because doing it would require a degree of emotional vulnerability that feels more dangerous than anything the multiverse has ever thrown at him. Rick is the smartest man in the universe. He just can't quite be the bravest. There is a third element of nihilism worth understanding in Rick's case, and it connects to the broader tradition of cosmic nihilism that the show operates within. Cosmic nihilism is the specific claim that not only does human existence lack inherent meaning, but that the sheer scale of the universe, its age, its size, the number of stars and planets, and potential consciousnesses it contains, renders any particular human life infinitely small. When you can travel to a dimension where an entire civilization exists inside a car battery, when you can peer into a universe within a universe within a universe and find the same essential patterns of striving and suffering and dying, playing out at every scale, the claim that your life is significant in any cosmic sense becomes very hard to maintain. Rick has seen this. He has seen it at a resolution so high that most people will never approach it, even conceptually. He has not just read about the scale of the universe, he has moved through it. He has watched civilizations rise and fall in the space of an afternoon. He has encountered beings of such incomprehensible power and indifference that the gods of every human religion look like local politicians by comparison. He has looked at the universe from inside and from outside at every scale, and in the consistent messages, nothing about you specifically was anticipated or required. This would break most people. It nearly broke Rick, in the sense that it broke something in him, broke the part that expected meaning to be offered from outside, broke the part that believed in the special significance of human experience, broke the part that thought the universe was organized around concerns recognizable to a consciousness like his. And from the ruins of that break, he assembled his nihilism. Not as a philosophical position he chose because it seemed intellectually compelling, but as the only available framework for the view from where he was standing. And yet, and this is the critical, and there is always an and in Rick's nihilism, and however, a but, because Rick Sanchez, as in the full exercise of the most powerful intellect in the known multiverse, cannot quite complete the nihilistic project. He cannot arrive fully at not caring. He tries. The show shows us him trying, repeatedly, heroically, with enormous amounts of alcohol and an almost religious commitment to movement, as a substitute for stillness. He tries every day, and every day something happens that demonstrates he has not succeeded. He does something for Morty. He does something for Beth. He does something that a genuinely committed nihilist would never do, because a genuinely committed nihilist would never care enough to. The philosopher Albert Camus, who, as we will discuss shortly, has a great deal to say about all of this, made a distinction that I think illuminates Rick's exact predicament. He wrote about the difference between saying life is meaningless and genuinely living as though life were meaningless. These are not the same thing. Almost no one manages the second. Almost every person who professes nihilism continues to wake up in the morning, to eat food when hungry, to seek warmth when cold, to reach toward other people when lonely. And these behaviors are not consistent with genuine nihilism. They are consistent with a creature that has meaning-making written into its biology, that cannot stop producing attachment and preference and care regardless of what its philosophy claims. Rick cannot stop producing these things either. His nihilism is his stated position in his daily practice and his armor, and his explanation for everything he does. But it is not in the end the whole truth about him. And the show knows this, and the show loves him for it, and so do we. Something that feels less like Nietzsche and more like another philosopher entirely. A Frenchman who thought very carefully about what you're supposed to do when you accept that the universe is meaningless, but you still, impossibly, stubbornly, want to live. That philosopher's name was Albert Camus, and his philosophy has a very particular name. Section 4. The Absurd Hero, Camus, Sisyphus, and the Portal. Gun. Albert Camus was born in Algeria in 1913 and spent his life writing about a problem that he considered the only genuinely serious philosophical problem there is. Whether, given the apparent meaninglessness of existence, life is worth living. He was not cheerful about this question. He was not particularly optimistic. But he was, in his own way, deeply hopeful, or at least deeply committed to a version of living that refused to collapse into despair, even while honestly acknowledging that despair was a completely rational response to the human condition. Camus wrote a philosophical essay in 1942 called The Myth of Sisyphus. The essay begins with one of the most famous opening sentences in the history of philosophy. There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Not a gentle beginning, but Camus' point is not nihilistic. It is exactly the opposite. By naming suicide as the central question, he is asking, given everything, given the absence of inherent meaning, given the indifference of the cosmos, what is the argument for continuing? What makes life worth living in a universe that offers no guarantee, no divine plan, and no cosmic reassurance that your suffering means something? His answer involves a Greek myth. Sisyphus, in the original myth, was a king who cheated death, twice in fact, using cunning and boldness, and a genuine refusal to accept the way things were supposed to go. For this, the gods punished him with what they considered the perfect torture. He was condemned to push a boulder up a mountain for eternity. Not some mountains, but one. The same mountain, the same boulder, forever. Every time he neared the top, the boulder rolled back down, and Sisyphus was forced to descend and begin again. The task was not just difficult, it was designed to be pointless. It was designed to embody futility itself. Camus looks at this myth and sees the human condition, not as metaphor, but as direct description. This is us. This is what we do. We go to work. But we build things. We maintain relationships that require constant maintenance. We push the boulder. And every night it rolls back and we do it again tomorrow. The task never completes. The mountain never runs out. The boulder never stays at the top. And anyone who is paying attention, really paying attention, with the honest intelligence that Camus values above almost everything else, can see this clearly. Most people, Camus argues, avoid this clarity. They find ways to not quite see what's happening. Religion provides one escape, the assurance that the boulder will eventually reach the permanent summit of an afterlife that rewards the pushing. Other frameworks provide similar escapes, the idea of progress, of legacy, of meaning through contribution. These are all, Camus argues, the forms of what he calls philosophical suicide. The willingness to leap past the honest recognition of the absurd into some comforting belief that dissolves the problem without actually solving it. Camus refuses the leap. He insists on staying with the absurd, with the full, unblinking recognition that the boulder will always roll back down and the pushing will never end, and no divine authority is going to come explain why any of this is necessary. He stays with that recognition and then, from inside it, asks, "Now what?" And his answer is magnificent in its simplicity. One must imagine Sisyphus happy, not resigned, not lobotomized, not performing contentment. Happy, genuinely, defiantly, consciously happy, not in spite of the futility, but through it, because of it, in full ownership of it. Sisyphus descends the mountain toward the boulder that has yet again rolled to the bottom. And in that descent, in that breathing space between one struggle and the next, Camus says that Sisyphus is above his fate. He is stronger than the rock. He owns the mountain and the boulder and the endless task in a way the gods never anticipated when they designed his punishment. The punishment was supposed to break him. Instead, it made his struggle his own. Now imagine Rick Sanchez with a portal gun. The parallels between Rick and the Camusian absurd hero are so precise that it's hard to believe they're accidental. Camus identifies the absurd hero as someone who displays scorn for the gods, a hatred of death, and a passion for life. Rick has all three. He regularly defeats, outwits, or simply ignores entities who consider themselves divine. But he has cheated death in ways and quantities that would make Sisyphus look like an amateur. And for all his stated nihilism, for all his professed indifference to existence, Rick's engagement with life is total. He is in it completely. He drinks too much and runs too fast, and invents too wildly and cares too deeply about the people around him to be anyone's idea of a genuinely indifferent nihilist. His passion for life, Maya, his furious, restless, relentless passion, is the most obvious thing about him to anyone paying attention. The portal gun is Rick's boulder, or more accurately, it is the thing that lets him push the boulder. It is his instrument of continuous engagement with an absurd universe. With it, he can go anywhere, do anything, experience anything, and the show, over its many seasons and many adventures, makes clear that none of it satisfies him. None of it resolves the fundamental question. None of the adventures lead anywhere that feels like arrival. The boulder always rolls back. The next adventure is always waiting at the foot of the mountain. But here is where Rick diverges from Camus' ideal. Because Camus' Sisyphus is fully conscious of his condition. He descends the mountain with clear eyes, fully aware of what he is doing and why, and he makes his peace with it honestly. Rick, by contrast, spends enormous amounts of energy not being fully conscious of his condition. He self-medicates with alcohol. He creates distractions, increasingly elaborate, increasingly galaxy-spanning distractions, to avoid the pauses on the way back down the mountain. The pauses are dangerous for Rick. The pauses are where the grief lives. Camus would look at Rick and see someone who has understood the absurd but refuses the final step. He has looked at the meaningless universe and not collapsed. He has not leaped into false hope. He has not made a convenient peace with comfortable lies. He has, in that sense, done the hard thing, but he has not made his condition his own. He has not descended the mountain with his head raised. He has descended the mountain with his flask raised, which is not quite the same thing. There are moments in the show, brief and precious, and usually followed immediately by a joke or an explosion, where Rick comes close, where you can see him almost arrive at the Camusian peace, the honest, eyes-open contentment of a man who knows exactly what he is doing and has decided to do it anyway. The relationship with Morty contains these moments. So does the relationship with Beth. They tend to last about 30 seconds before Rick does something self-destructive, which is the show's way of telling us that Rick is not there yet. He can see the mountain. He just can't quite accept it. But he is in the struggle, and Camus, at the very least, would say that the struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Rick, if not happy, then at least still trying. Which, coming from Rick Sanchez, amounts to roughly the same thing. Section 5. The Architecture of Grief. Diane and What We Carry. Let's stay for a while in the quiet place. There is a dimension, somewhere in the infinite multiverse of Rick and Morty, that is called C137. It is our Rick's original home. In that dimension, Rick Sanchez had a wife named Diane, and she had light blonde hair and a heart-shaped face, and she believed in her husband's work. And she made the eggs really well in the mornings, according to the only brief mention of her that comes early in the series before we know the full story. She was, by every account the show eventually gives us, a good person. Not a complicated person. Not a genius. Not someone with universe-spanning ambitions. Just a good person who loved her husband and her daughter, and was present in the ordinary daily way that matters more than any of the spectacular things get written about in history. She died in a bomb blast sent through a portal by another version of the man she was married to. A version of Rick who had decided, long before, that love was weakness, and that weakness was unacceptable. She died because one Rick, somewhere in the infinite, chose power over connection, and the Rick who lost her chose, in his grief, to become something that looked very much like the thing that destroyed him. Grief is one of philosophy's oldest subjects, and one of its least satisfactorily resolved ones. The ancient Stoics wrote about it at length. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus, who was himself born into slavery and spent his life thinking about what could and could not be controlled, argued that grief was the result of incorrectly valuing things outside our control. That if we loved wisely, if we held the things we loved lightly, aware always that they could be taken, then loss would not devastate us. We would mourn, yes, but we would not be broken. It is a beautiful and deeply inhuman philosophy. The kind of philosophy that works, perhaps in theory, and that almost no one manages in practice, because the entire point of loving something deeply is that it becomes unthinkable to hold it lightly. Deep love and stoic detachment are, functionally, incompatible. You can have one or the other. Rick, whatever else he is, clearly loved Diane with the kind of depth that makes the stoic approach impossible. The philosopher Martin Heidegger wrote about what he called authentic existence, the idea that facing the reality of our own mortality and the mortality of everyone and everything we love is what allows us to live genuinely. To not face it is to live in what Heidegger called das Man, the anonymous crowd consciousness that substitutes convention and distraction for genuine engagement with being. Rick has confronted death in every form it takes. He has no illusions about the finality of it, no comforting beliefs about what comes after. In that sense, he is what Heidegger would call fully authentic. He has looked at the abyss, and he knows exactly what it is. And yet Heidegger's authentic existence was supposed to produce engagement, presence, genuine care for the people and projects one has chosen. Rick's confrontation with mortality has produced the opposite. Distance, avoidance, the systematic dismantling of every relationship before it can become something he might one day have to mourn again. The grief of losing Diane did not make Rick more present in his life. It made him terrified of presence. It made him allergic to the conditions that produce grief, which is to say, the conditions that produce love. This is one of the most psychologically honest things the show does with Rick's character. The standard arc in fiction is for great loss to ultimately open a character, to crack them open in a way that eventually lets the light in. Rick's arc is the opposite. The loss closed him. It armored him. It sent him on a decades-long revenge quest that was, functionally, a way of converting grief into purpose so that he never had to simply sit with the grief itself. The hunt for Rick Prime was not just vengeance, it was the most elaborate distraction imaginable. It was a project so enormous, so consuming, so existentially complex, that Rick could spend 50 years doing it without ever having to stop and feel what he actually felt. Freud wrote about the distinction between mourning and melancholia, between the healthy, if painful, process of grief that eventually allows someone to reinvest in life, and the pathological state of melancholia in which grief gets stuck, in which the loss becomes a kind of permanent interior residence that the person refuses to fully leave. Rick is, in a very precise psychological sense, melancholic. He never properly mourned Diane. He transformed the mourning into a quest, and the quest kept him busy, and the busyness kept him from sitting in the quiet room where Diane's absence lived. The show handles this with remarkable subtlety. We don't often see Rick explicitly grieving. What we see instead is the displacement activities, the obsessive invention, the alcohol, the restless dimension hopping, the cultivated inability to stay still long enough for the silence to start speaking. The show tells us, in a dozen quiet ways, that Rick is not running towards something. He is running away from the version of himself that sits still long enough to remember. But he carries it anyway. Grief is not something you can outrun. It is, as many philosophers and psychologists have argued, the mark of what mattered. Grief is not weakness. Grief is not failure. Grief is the necessary shadow of love, the form that love takes when its object is gone. The grief Rick carries for Diane is proof, in the most basic existential sense, of what Diane meant to him. And no amount of nihilist philosophy, no proclamation that love is merely chemistry, no multiverse full of distractions, can actually dissolve that proof. The show gives us a moment, very late in its run, where Rick finally kills Rick Prime, the Rick who murdered Diane, the nemesis that organized his life for half a century. And the response, the immediate emotional aftermath, is not catharsis. It is not the triumphant resolution that decades of obsession promised. Rick falls into a depression. He loses his sense of purpose. Because without the hunt, there is nothing standing between him and the grief he has been avoiding. The project that made the grief productive is over, and now there is just the grief. That is one of the most honest things any work of fiction has ever shown us about what loss looks like when you've been avoiding it for a very long time. The avoidance has a logic, and the logic is that the purpose is better than the emptiness. But when the purpose ends, the emptiness was always going to be there waiting. Patient, unhurried, as permanent as the mountain. What we carry shapes us more than we typically acknowledge. The weight of Diane's absence is not separable from Rick's intelligence, from his philosophy, from his nihilism, from his relationship with Morty, from his incapacity for therapy, from the central finite curve, from the citadel, from the alcohol, from the greatness and the destruction and the love he refuses to name. Every single thing about the Rick we know is downstream of that garage bomb in Dimension C-137. That is what grief does when it doesn't get to be grief. It builds a man. And the man it builds looks, from the outside, nothing like someone in pain. He looks from the outside like the smartest person in the universe, who drinks too much and can't sit still. He sounds like a nihilist. He acts like someone who has decided nothing matters. But he hunted Rick Prime for 50 years. He hunted him across the multiverse, through every dimension the portal gun could reach, with a devotion that should feel familiar. Because it is the devotion of someone who loved something so completely that even the person who destroyed it could not make him stop. There is something else worth saying about grief and philosophy that the show gets exactly right in its handling of Rick's loss, and it is this. Grief is not a problem to be solved. This is one of the most fundamental misunderstandings that both Western culture and a certain kind of intelligence produce. Grief is treated, by culture and by smart people especially, as a task. Something you work through, process, arrive at the end of, and then file away. The therapeutic language of stages and closure and moving on is not entirely wrong. but it can produce a model in which grief becomes a puzzle whose solution is the absence of grief. Rick has treated his grief precisely this way. He turned it into a project, the project of finding and killing Rick Prime. And he undertook it with the full force of his genius, because genius can be applied to anything that can be framed as a solvable problem. But grief is not a solvable problem. Grief is the ongoing relationship between you and someone who is no longer there. It is not a phase that concludes. It is something you carry differently over time. It shifts in weight, changes in character, settles into different places in you as the years go. But the ending of it is not the point and never was. The point is the ongoing acknowledgement of what mattered. The point is not moving on, but the point is moving forward while continuing to carry what you carry. Rick could not accept this. His intelligence told him there was an answer, a solution, a terminus. And so he built a project with a terminus. Find Rick Prime, kill him, and then what? The show tells us what? Then nothing. Then the absence that was always waiting. Then the understanding arrived at too late, and the only way understanding ever truly arrives, that the project was never going to take care of the thing he thought it was going to take care of. This is heartbreaking. It is also philosophically precise. The Stoics were wrong that detachment is the answer to loss. Freud's stages were incomplete, but they were both pointing at the same uncomfortable truth that grief teaches every single person who goes through it. The path through is not around, but the path through loss is through the loss itself. The sitting with it, the naming of it, the terrible work that Dr. Wong called boring because it is boring, because being present with the thing that hurts is the dullest and most necessary work there is, and no portal gun in the multiverse can substitute for it. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything. Section 6, Intelligence as a Curse. The Lovecraftian Weight of Knowing. The horror writer H.P. Lovecraft, whose influence on Rick and Morty is woven through the show's very DNA, including the Cthulhu-like creature that appears in the opening credits, wrote about a particular kind of terror that he called cosmic horror. The essential idea is simple. There are things in the universe so vast, so alien, so fundamentally incompatible with human comprehension that knowing about them is itself a form of injury. In Lovecraft's fiction, encountering the truth of the universe doesn't expand the characters who encounter it. It breaks them. Madness is the standard response to genuine cosmic knowledge in Lovecraft's world. The universe, truly known, is too much for the human mind. Rick and Morty engages with this tradition directly. It is, by genre classification, a cosmic horror comedy, a show that takes the Lovecraftian premise of a vast and indifferent universe and plays it both for laughs and for genuine, sustained existential dread. Rick's portal gun takes him to exactly the kinds of places Lovecraft wrote about. The alien, the incomprehensible, the places where human scale simply does not apply. And the show is honest about what it does to the people who go there regularly. But Rick and Morty makes an inversion of the standard Lovecraftian formula that is essential to understanding Rick's specific tragedy. In Lovecraft's stories, the characters who encounter cosmic horror are ordinary people. Their madness comes from being unprepared for what they find. The universe breaks them because they were never equipped to face it. Rick is the opposite. Rick is maximally equipped. And yet the show does something more with the Camasian framework than simply noting the parallels. It uses the multiverse itself as the ultimate expression of the absurd. Because here is the thing, in an infinite multiverse, the absurd is not just a philosophical position. It is literal truth. There are infinite versions of every choice you could ever make, and every decision you agonize over has already been made in every possible direction by a version of you in some other dimension. The stakes of any particular action are, in the literal sense, infinitely diluted. Nothing matters because everything is already happening somewhere. Every possible version of every possible life is already being lived by someone. This is the context in which Rick's adventures take place. Not just the philosophical context, but the mathematical one. And it is deeply, structurally absurd in the precise Camasian sense because Rick continues to act. He continues to make choices and care about outcomes and invest himself in particular results. He continues to do this even though, intellectually, he knows that the version of events he is participating in is one of infinite versions. He knows there is a dimension where he made different choices, and a different version of him is dealing with different consequences. And he acts anyway. This is the revolt Camus talked about. Not the revolt of the person who doesn't know the odds. The revolt of the person who knows the odds precisely and acts anyway, in full possession of that knowledge. Choosing engagement over withdrawal, not because engagement is guaranteed to produce anything lasting, but because engagement is what consciousness does when it is fully alive to its own situation. Rick is fully alive to his own situation in a way that is both his greatest quality and the source of his most sustained suffering. He is conscious in the way Sisyphus is conscious descending the mountain, aware completely kind of what he is doing and what it costs and what it will require again tomorrow. And he keeps doing it anyway. He keeps pushing. Camus said that one must imagine Sisyphus happy. I am not sure we can quite manage that with Rick, but we can imagine him as he descends toward the boulder, choosing to descend. Choosing the mountain again. Choosing in the only sense that matters to be here. Rick is the opposite. Rick is maximally equipped. Rick is by every available measure the most intelligent being in the universe, or at least in the section of the universe that the central finite curve encompasses. He is not broken by the universe because he cannot comprehend it. He is broken by it because he can. He is broken by it precisely because his intelligence is sufficient to see the full picture, to understand the full implications, to map the full architecture of meaninglessness with perfect clarity and then have to live inside that map every day. The therapist Dr. Wong, whose brief appearance in the Pickle Rick episode contains more genuine philosophical insight than most characters get in their entire arcs, observes this directly. She tells Rick that he alternates between viewing his own mind as an unstoppable force and as an inescapable curse. That's a very precise diagnosis. Rick's intelligence is his most powerful tool. It is also the thing that has most thoroughly destroyed his capacity for the kind of easy comfort that gets most people through the day. Think about what it would actually mean to be the smartest person in the universe, to see instantly through every social convention and comforting fiction that makes ordinary life livable. To understand, at a level most people never approach, the actual scale of the universe and the actual smallness of any individual life within it. To grasp, not as an abstract intellectual idea, but as a lived, felt reality, that there are infinite versions of every person you have ever loved, and that the version you love is functionally interchangeable with those others, except for the pure accident of which dimension you happen to inhabit. This last point is one that the show explores repeatedly and always with a certain horror that never fully becomes funny. Rick can replace things. He can find another Earth, another version of himself and Morty, in a dimension where their counterparts have conveniently just died. He can erase and restore memories. He can sidestep consequences in ways that no one else can because for everyone else, the consequences are inescapable. They are permanent. They are the substance of a life. For Rick, nothing is permanent in the ordinary sense. And this, which sounds like freedom, and which Rick often presents as freedom, as the ultimate expression of the technological and philosophical liberation he has achieved, is actually a specific kind of horror. Permanence is what gives things weight. Irreversibility is what makes moments matter. If nothing is permanent, if everything can be undone or replaced or dimensionally rerouted, then nothing has the kind of meaning that comes from being unrepeatable. Nothing carries the weight that only unrepeatable things can carry. Best the Lovecraftian irony at the heart of Rick's character is this. The intelligence that lets him see the universe clearly is the same intelligence that prevents him from experiencing it the way ordinary people do. Ordinary people are protected from cosmic horror by the limits of their own comprehension. The universe is terrifying, but they don't quite know how terrifying. They feel it at the edges sometimes, in moments of grief or existential crisis, but most of the time the daily texture of life keeps the full picture safely blurred. Rick has no such protection. He sees the full picture all the time. And the full picture is not comforting. There is a name in ancient philosophical thought for what happens when knowledge becomes its own form of suffering. The Stoics wrote about it. Schopenhauer. As the German pessimist philosopher who heavily influenced Nietzsche, built an entire philosophical system around the idea that the more developed a consciousness becomes, the more intensely it suffers. Because a more developed consciousness is a consciousness more thoroughly aware of the gap between what existence is and what a suffering creature might wish it to be. Schopenhauer thought that intelligence was, in a fundamental sense, bad news. The will to live, as he called it, the blind, striving, relentless engine of existence, produces constant, unsatisfied desire, and a more intelligent being is one who experiences that unsatisfied desire more acutely and understands its causes more completely. Rick is, in Schopenhauer's terms, the worst possible case, the most intelligent version of the worst possible case. But he doesn't have the consolation of not quite understanding why he's suffering. He understands exactly why he's suffering. He could write the doctoral thesis on his own suffering and make it the most complete and rigorously argued document in the history of the multiverse. And understanding your suffering, it turns out, does not make it hurt less. It just makes it different, sharper, more certain. The catchphrase that Bird Person reveals as the translation of Rick's signature greeting is the most Lovecraftian thing about him. That seemingly cheerful, chaotic phrase, the one he bellows at the beginning of adventures and uses as a kind of signature flourish, translates to, "I am in great pain. Please help me." Not an excuse, not a joke, a direct statement of his actual condition, and hidden in plain sight for anyone in the universe who happened to speak Bird Person's language. And perhaps no one who spoke only English, watching Rick move through his adventures with that terrifying confidence, would ever guess. But this is how Lovecraftian knowledge works. It doesn't shout, it whispers. It lives underneath the surface of the ordinary, which remains outwardly intact while the depths below it become increasingly impossible to inhabit. Rick's ordinary surface, the swagger, the sarcasm, the apparently limitless competence, is perfectly intact. He is very good at the surface. It is underneath the surface, in the place where the translation of his greeting lives, where the cosmic horror of knowing everything has made its home. Section 7. Pickle Rick and the Cowardice of Genius. In the third season of Rick and Morty, there is an episode called Pickle Rick. It is, on its surface, one of the most absurd things the show has ever done. Rick, faced with the prospect of attending family therapy, turns himself into a pickle. A small, ordinary, green pickle with no arms or legs, lying on a workbench in his garage. He lies there, immobile and pickle-shaped, rather than participate in a therapy session with his daughter and grandchildren. The episode is remarkable not for the action movie sequence that follows, which is genuinely, almost deranged in its inventiveness, involving rats and cockroaches in a heavily fortified Russian compound, but for what happens at the end, in the brief and devastating scene where Rick, still in pickle form, ends up sitting across from the therapist Dr. Wong, played with wonderful precision by Susan Sarandon. Doctor. Wong does not blink. She has seen everything. She works, as she herself mentions, with people who have coprophagia, people who eat feces and would like to stop. A man pickle who has just MacGyvered his way through a building full of armed guards is not going to rattle her. And so she says to Rick, very quietly and very clearly, the thing that he has spent decades and an entire multiverse avoiding hearing. The only connection between your unquestionable intelligence and the sickness destroying your family is that everyone in your family, you included, use intelligence to justify sickness. She says that he alternates between viewing his own mind as an unstoppable force and an inescapable curse. She says that the only truly unapproachable concept for him is that his mind is within his control. She says that she has no doubt he would be bored senseless by therapy, in the same way she is bored when she brushes her teeth and wipes herself. Because the thing about repairing and maintaining and cleaning is that it's not an adventure. There's no way to do it so wrong that you might die. It's just work. And then she says, each of us gets to choose. That is the philosophical core of the entire episode, and in some sense, the philosophical core of Rick's entire character. Rick doesn't lack the intelligence to understand his own dysfunction. He understands it perfectly. He understands it better than any therapist could hope to explain it to him. Because he already sees it, already maps it, already knows exactly how the machinery of his avoidance works and why. His problem is not ignorance. His problem is choice. And he is choosing not to do the work. And he is using his intelligence as the justification for that choice, constructing an elaborate philosophical edifice in which emotional maintenance is beneath him, in which the hard, boring work of being a functioning person is something that intelligent people have transcended. This is, and I say this as someone who finds Rick endlessly compelling, a form of cowardice. It is the specific cowardice of very smart people who have discovered that intelligence can be used as an avoidance mechanism. The ability to see a problem clearly does not automatically produce the willingness to address it. Sometimes, and Rick is the most extreme example, seeing a problem perfectly clearly is actually an obstacle to addressing it. Because once you can see all the angles, you can also see all the reasons why any particular approach might fail, all the ways the outcome might be bad, all the risks and vulnerabilities involved in genuinely trying. The philosopher Soren Kierkegaard wrote about what he called the aesthetic life stage, the mode of existence in which a person privileges sensation, novelty, and the avoidance of boredom above all else. The aesthetic person is always looking for the next interesting thing, always moving, always creating new experiences to replace the ones that have gone stale. It is, Kierkegaard argued, an ultimately empty mode of existence, not because pleasure and sensation are bad, but because they cannot by themselves provide the continuity and depth that a genuinely meaningful life requires. The aesthetic stage, pursued indefinitely, produces a kind of paralysis beneath all the activity. The person moves constantly because stopping means sitting with themselves. Rick lives, very largely, in Kierkegaard's aesthetic stage. His adventures are the ultimate expression of aesthetic avoidance, maximally stimulating, maximally novel, maximally removing from any situation that might require him to do something as boring and risky as genuinely connecting with another person. The portal gun is the world's most sophisticated distraction device. And the thing it is distracting from is the thing that Dr. Wong identified, the simple, unglamorous, irreplaceable work of actually being present in a relationship. The Pickle Rick episode is also, it is worth noting, a commentary on a specific version of toxic masculinity, the version that mistakes emotional avoidance for strength. Rick builds himself physical armor in the episode, literally. He constructs armor out of dead rats and cockroaches to protect his vulnerable pickle body from physical harm. It is, as many critics have noted, one of the most perfect visual metaphors for the emotional armor Rick carries everywhere he goes. He will die, has nearly died, many times, rather than feel unprotected. And the armor is always the same: his intelligence, his sarcasm, his performance of total self-sufficiency. But Dr. Wong is right. The armor is not strength. The armor is the evidence of how frightened he is. The people who need the most elaborate defenses are usually the people who feel the most exposed without them. And Rick, who has lost almost everything he ever loved, who knows from direct experience how complete and how irreversible a loss can be, has built his defenses to the scale of the catastrophe he is protecting himself from. It would take an extraordinary loss to produce extraordinary armor. And Rick's loss was extraordinary. This does not excuse the avoidance. Camus, remember, would say that the only honest response to the absurd is engagement. Full, conscious, eyes-open engagement with the reality of one's situation. Running from the reality of your situation, even at the speed Rick runs, even across infinite dimensions, is not engagement. It is flight. And flight is, in Camus' terms, a form of philosophical suicide. The abandonment of the hard clarity that genuine absurdist living requires. There is a beautiful irony in the fact that Rick turns himself into a pickle to avoid therapy. A pickle is, among other things, a preservation technique. That you put something in brine to keep it from changing, to keep it from decaying, yes, but also to keep it from becoming anything new. Rick, by becoming a pickle, becomes a symbol of exactly what he is doing with his emotional life. Preserving himself in a state of arrested development, using the brine of nihilism and sarcasm and perpetual motion to avoid the natural process of change and growth that normally happens to humans when they engage honestly with their grief and their relationships and the limits of their own coping mechanisms. He is literally a preserved thing, and Dr. Wong sees it immediately. She brushes her teeth and wipes herself without drama, because that is what adults do with the boring, necessary tasks of their own maintenance. And then she watches the most powerful being in the multiverse drip rat blood and refuse to do the same. She offers him a card. She says she hopes to hear from them again. She delivers the whole devastating thing without raising her voice once. And Rick, after a very brief silence, apologizes. He says he's sorry he lied to get out of the thing. It is 30 seconds. It is the most emotionally honest 30 seconds in the episode. And then the show moves on because that is also what the show does. It shows you the moment of almost arrival and then pivots away because Rick cannot quite stay in the moment of honesty long enough for it to take root. But he apologizes. That matters. It matters more than he would ever admit. Section 8. The central finite curve. Building walls around meaning. Somewhere in the architecture of the Rick and Morty multiverse, there exists a structure called the central finite curve. The show takes several seasons to reveal it, and when it does, the reveal lands with the weight of something that was always there, always implied, always the obvious answer to a question the show had been building towards since the beginning. The central finite curve is a boundary, not a physical wall, not a planetary border, but a mathematical partition in the fabric of the multiverse. On one side of it, all the infinite universes in which Rick Sanchez is the smartest being alive. On the other side, all the infinite universes in which he is not. That the citadel of Ricks, the civilization of Ricks who came together from across dimensions, built this boundary deliberately. They located every universe in which their name meant the most powerful thing in the room, and they walled it off from the rest. They created a bubble of supremacy, a managed universe in which, no matter which dimension you walked into, Rick Sanchez would always be the dominant force. When Evil Morty explains this to the assembled Ricks during his presidency, he calls it exactly what it is. They built a wall around infinity. They separated an infinite number of universes from all the infinite universes where Rick isn't the smartest man alive. They took the multiverse and kept only the piece of it that confirmed what they already believed about themselves. This is philosophically one of the most precise critiques of a certain kind of nihilism that any piece of popular fiction has ever managed to sneak past the audience, hidden inside an animated science fiction comedy. The central finite curve is Rick's nihilism made institutional. It is the externalization of his psychological avoidance. He doesn't just run from the things that make him feel small. He built a political and spatial structure to ensure he never has to encounter them. He didn't just tell himself that nothing matters. He engineered a version of the multiverse in which his own significance is guaranteed, hermetically sealed away from any reality that might contradict it. And the contradiction is rich. The man who says nothing matters spent decades building an elaborate, interdimensional infrastructure to protect his own status. The man who says love is a chemical reaction maintained enough attachment to a version of his daughter that he wandered the infinite until he found a Beth to move in with. The man who says the universe is cold and indifferent created, with extraordinary effort, a warm little section of it where he would always be the most important thing. This is not the behavior of someone who has genuinely made peace with meaninglessness. This is the behavior of someone who is afraid of meaninglessness and is building architecture around his fear. Kierkegaard again is useful here. He wrote about what he called despair, not in the ordinary sense of sadness or hopelessness, but in the specific existential sense of being in the wrong relationship with yourself. The most serious form of despair, in Kierkegaard's thinking, is the despair of someone who knows what they should be doing and refuses to do it. Not someone who doesn't know, but someone who knows perfectly well and builds elaborate structures to avoid it. This is what Kierkegaard called the sickness unto death. Not the acknowledgement of limitations, but the refusal to acknowledge them. The refusal made all the more terrible because it is always a knowing refusal. Rick knows what the central finite curve is. He helped build it. He understands, with full philosophical clarity, that he has enclosed himself in a lie. The rest of the multiverse, the infinite part that he walled off, contains universes where Rick Sanchez is ordinary, where Rick Sanchez is nobody, where Rick Sanchez is less intelligent than 1,000 other beings in his immediate vicinity. That truth exists. Rick knows it exists. And he has literally built a fence around it so he doesn't have to live next to it. The arrogance that this requires is interesting because it is not simple arrogance. It is not the arrogance of someone who doesn't know their limits. It is the arrogance of someone who knows their limits perfectly and finds them intolerable. There is a difference. Ordinary arrogance is comfortable, even jolly. Rick's arrogance is a white-knuckle operation. It is maintained at great cost against the constant threat of the reality it is designed to keep out. Evil Morty sees this clearly. Evil Morty, who is arguably the character in the show who best understands Rick's psychology because he has studied it from the inside out, from the position of being the sidekick that every Rick treats as an accessory rather than a person, identifies the central finite curve not as Rick's glory, but as Rick's baggy. Rick built a cage around the part of the multiverse where his self-concept works and locked himself inside it. He called it a home. He called it, through the Citadel, a civilization. But Evil Morty knows it for what it is. The philosophical lesson here connects directly to Camus. The absurd hero, as Camus described him, lives without walls. He lives in the full recognition of the absurd condition. The mismatch between the universe as it is and the universe as we wish it were. He doesn't build a version of the universe where the mismatch doesn't exist. He inhabits the mismatch consciously, deliberately, with open eyes, and finds his meaning in the living of that inhabitation, rather than in its resolution. Rick built a version of the universe where the mismatch doesn't exist, where his intelligence is always confirmed, where the hierarchy always puts him at the top, where the truth of the infinite multiverse, that there are infinite realities in which Rick Sanchez is nothing special, is simply unavailable to him. It is the most sophisticated comfort blanket ever constructed. It required decades of engineering and dimensional physics and the cooperation of thousands of alternate versions of himself. But at its heart, it is just a very clever way of not looking at something that hurts. The brilliant, as necessary thing that Evil Morty does is break the curve open. He punches a hole in it and walks through. Not because the other side is better, but the show does not tell us what the other side looks like, which is its own philosophical point, but because the wall is the problem. The wall is the lie. And a wall, no matter how well constructed, cannot be the foundation of a genuine life. When the central finite curve breaks, Rick is not left better off in any obvious sense. He is left exposed. But exposure in philosophical terms is not the same as devastation. Exposure is the first condition of genuine encounter. You cannot touch the thing you've built a wall around. You cannot be changed by it. You cannot learn from it or be comforted by it or find in its vast indifference the particular kind of peace that Camus' Sisyphus finds in honest engagement with his condition. The collapse of the central finite curve is Rick's chance. Whether he takes it as a story the show is still telling. Section 9, Love as Impossible Logic. Rick's contradiction. There is a line that Rick delivers early in the show with the full weight of his scientific authority behind it. Love is just a chemical reaction that compels animals to breed. It hits hard, he says, then it slowly fades, leaving you stranded in a failing marriage. He says this to Morty. He says it the way he says a lot of things to Morty, with the tone of someone who is not explaining so much as correcting, who has arrived at this conclusion through a process that he finds more rigorous and more honest than whatever naive belief Morty currently holds, and who wants to make sure Morty understands the universe as it actually is rather than as he might wish it to be. It is a perfect expression of Rick's stated philosophy. It is also, every time he says it or something like it, in almost direct contradiction with everything he actually does. There is a paradox at the center of Rick Sanchez that the show has been exploring since the beginning and has never resolved because it cannot be resolved without changing what Rick fundamentally is. The paradox is this: Rick is a nihilist who loves people, not in a small, contained, easily managed way, in an enormous, costly, completely inconsistent with his stated philosophy way. He loves Morty. He will not say this directly, not often, not clearly, but the show demonstrates it at every opportunity. That he puts himself between Morty and danger with the reflexiveness of someone whose protective instinct has overridden his calculation. He goes to extraordinary lengths to pull Morty out of impossible situations, lengths that cannot be explained by simple utility or strategic necessity. In his most vulnerable moments, The moments when the armor slips, it is usually Morty who prompts it. The relationship between them is not the relationship of a scientist and a useful tool. It is the relationship of two people who have been through something together that only they can share. Something that has made them, against all logic and all stated philosophy, essential to each other. He loves Beth. This one is complicated and recursive and entangled with the guilt of having been absent for her childhood. That with the complicated dynamics of a father-daughter relationship, where the father left and then came back expecting things to be the same, and the daughter let him back in because she needed him and resented needing him. But underneath the complexity, underneath the ways that Rick enables Beth's worst tendencies, and Beth enables Rick's worst tendencies, and they reflect each other's damage back in patterns that would take actual therapy to untangle. Underneath all of that, he loves her. He loves her the way you love someone who is made partly of you. She is his daughter. In the only universe that matters for our Rick, she is the daughter who survived. And everything he does, including the things he does that damage her, is in some sense in response to that love and to the guilt of the original loss. He loved Bird Person. He loved him in the way that wars make people love each other. The forged, permanent bond that comes from surviving together, things that most people never have to survive at all. The grief of losing Bird Person, of watching him shot at his own wedding and then rebuilt as a weapon by the people who killed him, is one of the show's most devastating arcs. And it is devastating specifically because it contradicts everything Rick professes to believe. You cannot grieve this precisely for someone you consider chemically irrelevant. You cannot fight this hard to bring someone back if you genuinely believe that bonds between people have no transcendent meaning. He loved Diane. We have already been here, but it bears returning to because the love of Diane is not a piece of Rick's story. It is the architecture of everything else. It is the fact from which all other facts derive. He loved her so completely that losing her remade him into someone whose central operating principle is the avoidance of losing anyone else, achieved through the systematic dismantling of the conditions under which such love could form again. His nihilism is love turned inside out. His philosophy of meaninglessness is the meaning of a particular loss, sublimated into a worldview because it was too large to be carried as grief. The philosopher Erich Fromm, in his 1956 work, The Art of Loving, argued that love is not simply a feeling that happens to people. It is a practice, a discipline, something that requires ongoing active engagement. He distinguished between mature love, which is grounded in the full recognition of another person's separateness and dignity, and immature love, which is essentially a kind of possession or dependency. Mature love, Fromm argued, is rarer than people think, and it requires a willingness to be changed by the other person, to be genuinely affected by their reality, to remain open to the vulnerability that genuine encounter with another consciousness always involves. Rick's love for Diane, as much as the show allows us to glimpse it, looks like Fromm's mature love. He was changed by her. He was affected by her reality. He built a life around her presence. And when she was gone, the capacity for that kind of love did not disappear. It went into hiding. It became too dangerous to exercise. The wounds of the mature lover are too deep to risk again. So Rick learned, or tried to learn, the architecture of emotional distance. He learned to make love safe by making it casual, by declaring it biological, by treating connection as utility. But the practice didn't take. It never quite took. And the show is, in its heart, the story of that failure, the failure to stop caring, the failure to become the nihilist he performs, the failure to make himself as cold and self-sufficient as his philosophy requires him to be. The philosopher Simone Weil, who wrote about love and attention in ways that have no direct parallel in the Western philosophical tradition, argued that genuine love is an act of attention, the full, unself-conscious, unpossessive orientation toward another person's reality. She called this the highest form of consciousness available to human beings. By this measure, Rick's love, difficult and buried and defended with extraordinary engineering, is also, in its best moments, at one of the most profound expressions of attention on the show. When Rick pays attention to Morty, when he is genuinely present with him, rather than managing him or using him or running from something, the quality of that attention is total. It is the attention of a man whose intelligence in those moments is completely in the service of another person's experience rather than his own survival. Those moments are brief. They are followed almost immediately by flight or deflection or a joke that breaks the spell. But they are there. And they are evidence of what Rick is capable of when he lets himself be, which is both everything and the reason that everything hurts so much. The existential philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre wrote that existence precedes essence, that we are not born with a predetermined purpose, but that we make ourselves through our choices and our commitments. Rick's essence, the thing he has made himself into through a lifetime of choices, looks on the surface like a man who has decided that nothing matters. But underneath that surface, in the 50-year hunt, in the reflexive protection of Morty, in the return to Beth's dimension, in the ongoing improbable fact of his continued relationship with the Smith family, his choices tell a different story. His choices say that he has decided, whatever his philosophy claims, that some things do matter, that some people are worth the risk of losing. The philosopher Martha Nussbaum, in her work on the relationship between vulnerability and love, argues that to love is necessarily to accept a particular kind of fragility. You cannot love without accepting the possibility of loss. And accepting that possibility is not weakness. It is, in Nussbaum's term, the constitutive condition of a fully human life. The attempt to achieve invulnerability, to protect yourself so completely that loss becomes impossible, is not wisdom. It is the self-impoverishment of someone who has decided that safety is worth more than depth. Rick is in a constant negotiation between these two positions. His philosophy says safety. His heart, such as it is, such as he allows it to be, says depth. And the show is, at its core, the story of a man who has invested enormously in safety and who keeps being dragged back toward depth by the people who love him and the love he cannot quite stop returning. This is not a resolution. It is a tension. And the show is right not to resolve it. Because in real human lives, this tension doesn't resolve either. People carry these contradictions their whole lives. They believe, or say they believe, things that their actions consistently contradict. They build walls and then leave doors in them. They claim invulnerability and then bleed when cut. This is not hypocrisy in the simple sense. It is the condition of being a creature complex enough to hold contradictions simultaneously. To know that love is biochemistry and still love. To know that nothing lasts and still mourn what ends. To know that the universe doesn't care and still care desperately about the people in it. Rick is a nihilist who loves people. That is the whole thing. That is the show, distilled. And the reason it resonates so powerfully, not the reason millions of people watch this cartoon about a drunk scientist and feel something they weren't expecting to feel, is that so many of them are something similar. Not nihilists necessarily, but people who have told themselves a story about not caring while going about the daily business of caring very much. People who have built armor and then been surprised to find, still alive inside it, the things they were trying to protect. Rick is us, wearing a lab coat and carrying a flask. That's the whole thing. Section 10. Finding purpose in the meaningless. What Rick teaches us. Let's slow down even further. Let's breathe. The question that Rick and Morty has been asking over and over from every angle its writers can find since the very first episode is the same question that philosophers have been asking for as long as there have been philosophers. It is the question underneath the nihilism and the absurdism and the cosmic horror and the Camus and the Nietzsche and the Lovecraft. It is simpler than all of those and more personal. How do you live in a universe that doesn't care about you? That is the question. And it is not a rhetorical question, and it is not a question that only applies to genius scientists with portal guns. It is a question for everyone. It is a question that humans have been answering inadequately, bravely, imperfectly, and sometimes with great beauty, for as long as we have been conscious enough to understand that we are small and the universe is enormous and the universe was here before us and will be here after us and does not, fundamentally, require our presence. Rick Sanchez's answer is not a good one. Let's be honest about that. His answer is become indispensable. Make yourself the smartest. Build a wall around the part of the universe that needs you and try to live inside it without looking at the part that doesn't. Drink enough that the quiet moments don't get too quiet. Move fast enough that the grief doesn't catch up. It is a very human answer. It is not a good one, but it is very human. The impulse to build defenses, to make yourself necessary to the people around you through achievement or power or utility, to avoid the quiet rooms where the hardest questions live, this is not unique to Rick Sanchez. It is recognizable to almost anyone who has spent time thinking about their own life honestly. But the show also offers us, through Rick's failures and contradictions, and the moments when his armor slips, something closer to a better answer. Not a complete answer, there are no complete answers, but there are better ones. The better answer is in the relationships. It is always in the end in the relationships. In the moment when Rick comes back, when he could leave and doesn't, in the moment when Morty stands up to him and Rick doesn't walk away. In the quiet, imperfect continuity of a family that should have broken apart 100 times and hasn't, not because it is healthy, not because anyone in it is doing especially well, but because it is theirs. Because they have chosen each other again and again through adventures and disasters and dimensional relocations and family therapy sessions that everyone left early, they have kept choosing each other. There is a philosophical concept that comes from the tradition of virtue ethics, the tradition most associated with Aristotle, though developed and refined across many centuries, called eudaimonia. It is often translated as happiness, but that translation loses something important. Eudaimonia is better understood as flourishing. The condition of a person who is living in accordance with their deepest nature, exercising their characteristic capacities fully, engaged with the world in a way that expresses who they genuinely are. For Aristotle, the highest form of eudaimonia involved deep and mutual friendship, the kind of friendship that is not based on utility or pleasure alone, but on a recognition and cultivation of virtue in another person. He called this philia, and he thought it was one of the most important things a human life could contain. Rick has philia. He does not call it that. He would be actively resistant to calling it that. But the relationship with Morty, at its best, in the moments when they are genuinely together rather than Rick managing the situation and Morty reacting to it, is exactly what Aristotle described. It is two people who see something genuinely good in each other and whose relationship calls out the better versions of who they are. Morty's presence makes Rick slightly more careful, slightly more conscious of consequences, slightly more tethered to the human world. Rick's presence makes Morty braver, more capable, more willing to take on the parts of existence that are genuinely terrifying. Neither of them would put it this way. Now, Rick would probably say something dismissive about Morty's brainwaves being useful for evading detection. Morty would probably trip over his words and deny having feelings about it. But watch them in the moments that count. Watch what they're willing to do for each other. That is philia. That is virtue friendship. That is Aristotle in a flying car moving through the multiverse at the speed of a portal gun, making each other better in ways that neither of them would officially acknowledge. The philosopher Hannah Arendt wrote about what she called natality, the capacity of human beings to begin things, to start something new, to act in a way that introduces genuine novelty into the world. She placed this capacity at the center of what she thought was distinctly human and distinctly valuable about human existence. At the opposite of natality, in her thinking, was the complete determination of one's life by forces outside oneself. The reduction of a person to a thing moved by fate or circumstance rather than choice. Rick has natality in extraordinary abundance. Every invention, every adventure, every portal, torn in the fabric of the multiverse is an act of beginning, the introduction of something new that was not there before. This is, Arendt would say, his most essential human quality. It is also, arguably, his most consistent form of meaning-making. He cannot stop making things. He cannot stop beginning. Even in his worst moments, even at the bottom of his deepest depressions, Rick is making something. He is starting something. He is the most compulsive beginner in the history of the multiverse, and Arendt would say, yes. That is what being alive looks like, when it is fully expressed. That is what a person looks like when they have not given up. Camus would recognize this. In The Myth of Sisyphus, he describes what he calls the absurd life, the life lived in full consciousness of the absurd, without false hope, without philosophical suicide, without the leap of faith that tries to dissolve the tension by pretending it doesn't exist. The absurd life is characterized by three things: revolt, freedom, and passion. Revolt, the refusal to accept any answer that papers over the real conditions of existence. Freedom, the liberation that comes from having nothing to lose except the truth. And passion, the fullness of engagement with the actual world, the people in it, the experiences available to a consciousness that is honest about its situation. Rick has revolt in abundance. He has never accepted anything he didn't choose to accept, and his choices are always his own, always come at cost, always carry the full weight of a person who knows exactly what he's doing. His freedom is extraordinary, probably too extraordinary, probably the source of as many problems as it resolves. But his passion, that is the one that is hardest to see and the most important when you find it. Rick's passion is enormous and almost entirely disguised. It lives in the quality of his attention. When Rick cares about something, his engagement with it is total. The intelligence he brings to solving a problem on behalf of the people he loves is the same intelligence he brings to inventing a universe. He doesn't do anything halfway. When he is completely in. And despite all his stated philosophy, despite every protestation of indifference, he keeps getting in. He keeps showing up. He keeps being there, drinking his flask and grumbling and occasionally saving the world, in the garage of a family that he chose and keeps choosing. The Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor who governed the Roman Empire in the 2nd century, while writing his private philosophical reflections in a document we now call the Meditations, wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength." It is a statement that Rick would almost certainly find irritating in its simplicity, but there is something in it that applies. Rick's catastrophe was always outside events. The bomb through the portal, the death of Diane, the Rick Prime who set everything in motion. He had no power over any of that. On what he has power over is what happens next, what he does with the garage he has chosen to be in, who he decides to keep showing up for. And here's the thing, here is the quiet thing that the show keeps saying. Underneath all the noise and the explosions and the nihilism and the fart jokes, Rick does keep showing up. He shows up in ways he cannot fully account for. He shows up even when his stated philosophy says he shouldn't care. He shows up even when the armor is fully intact and the sarcasm is at maximum and the flask is in his hand, and everything about his presentation says, "I am here because I have nowhere better to be." He shows up because underneath all of that, he has decided that these people matter. Maybe not in the cosmic sense. Maybe not in the sense that would satisfy a philosopher looking for objective grounds for meaning, but in the only sense that actually operates in anyone's daily life. They matter to him. He has made them matter. And having made them matter, he cannot unmake it, any more than he could unmake the grief for Diane by telling himself that love is chemistry. This is what philosophy, at its most honest and most human, keeps arriving at. Not a proof of meaning, not a cosmic guarantee, but the recognition that meaning is what happens when a consciousness chooses to care and keeps choosing, even in the full knowledge that the universe hasn't asked it to and the universe won't remember. You make meaning the way you push the boulder, not because the boulder staying at the top is guaranteed, not because the mountain never ends, but because the act of pushing, done consciously and fully and with your whole self, is enough. The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Rick Sanchez, drunk, grieving, armored, brilliant, terrified, pushing his boulder. One must imagine him some days almost happy. The universe grazed on the ordinary. It created infinite idiots just to eat them. And one of those idiots, the most stubborn and the most intelligent and the most broken and the most loved, put a portal gun in his coat pocket and keeps going, keeps showing up, keeps mattering, despite his best efforts to the contrary. That is not nothing. That might, in the only sense that means anything, be everything. Section 11. Come watch tea. We have been on a long walk tonight, through nihilism and absurdism, through grief and love and the philosophy of Nietzsche and Camus, through Lovecraftian horror and Stoic acceptance and the strange, specific paradox of a man who says nothing matters, and then acts like almost everything does. We have walked through the garage of Dimension C-137, past the workbench where Diane died, past the portal gun that was built from that death, through the central finite curve and out the other side, into a multiverse that is vast and indifferent, and still somehow home to people who love each other and show up for each other and carry each other's weight, even when they're not very good at saying so. I want to end in the place that Morty ends, in one of the show's most frequently quoted and least frequently understood moments. He is talking to Summer, who is in distress about something, that she has just learned something about her family, about herself, about the accidental and contingent nature of her own existence. She is spiraling into the kind of existential crisis that awaits anyone who looks at things clearly enough. And Morty, who has been dragged across more dimensions than any 14-year-old should ever have to visit, who has buried his own dead body in a backyard and kept living in someone else's life, who has had Rick's philosophy dripping into him for years like rain through a roof that never quite got repaired. Morty says, "Nobody exists on purpose. Nobody belongs anywhere. Everybody's going to die. Come watch TV." I want to suggest that this is not nihilism. I want to suggest gently that this might be its opposite. Because the invitation at the end is not resignation. It is not giving up. And it is not the voice of someone who has accepted that nothing matters and is now lying down in the void. It is the voice of someone who has accepted the first three facts. Nobody exists on purpose. Nobody belongs anywhere. Everybody's going to die. And then, in full possession of those facts, extended a hand, come be here with me, come sit in this room, come watch something that neither of us will remember perfectly in 20 years. Come exist together in the unremarkable, ordinary, completely meaningless, and entirely irreplaceable present moment. That is Camus. That is the heart of absurdism. Not the despair, but the revolt. Not the collapse in the face of meaninglessness, but the decision made knowingly to inhabit the present moment anyway, to make it yours. To fill it with the people you've chosen and the things that bring you whatever version of comfort you can find, knowing that comfort is not guaranteed and never was, and choosing it anyway. Rick would never say this. Rick would never extend the invitation that simply, that vulnerably, that openly. Rick would make a joke and reach for his flask and open a portal to somewhere more interesting. But somewhere underneath the joke and the flask and the portal, somewhere in the same place where the translation of his catchphrase lives, the one that means I'm in great pain, please help me. Somewhere in there, Rick knows this too. He keeps coming back. That's the thing. After every catastrophe, as after every near death and every loss and every dimensional relocation and every season finale that seems to genuinely break something that cannot be repaired, he keeps coming back. To the house, to the garage, to the family, to the specific and improbable fact of Morty, who is there and who is his and who matters in the only sense of matters that ever actually matters. The universe doesn't care. And the people in it keep caring anyway. That is the whole show. That is the whole thing. Philosophy is not something that happens in books. It is not something that only takes place in lecture halls and academic journals and essays about ancient Greeks pushing boulders. Philosophy happens in the moment when you look at the size of everything and decide how small you're going to let it make you feel. My philosophy happens in the choice to show up for someone, even when your stated position is that showing up doesn't mean anything. Philosophy happens when a man who says love is chemistry risks his life for the third time this season for the people he calls his family. We have been here, together in this quiet space for a long time tonight, and I hope that some of it settled somewhere useful in you. I hope that thinking about Rick's grief helps you sit a little more gently with your own. I hope that thinking about his avoidance helps you recognize your own, without judgment. Because the whole point is not that Rick is bad for avoiding things. The point is that he is human. That it is human to build walls. That it is also human eventually to leave doors in them. I hope that the idea of Sisyphus, on descending the mountain with his head raised, knowing exactly what is waiting for him at the bottom, and choosing to walk toward it anyway, I hope that settles in somewhere too. Because you are pushing your own boulders. You are doing it every day. And the doing of it, the consciousness you bring to the descents as much as the climbs, is where your life actually lives. The universe didn't ask you to be here. The universe doesn't know you're here. The stars burning in distant galaxies have no awareness of the specific and completely unrepeatable fact of your consciousness, your particular collection of experiences, your love for whoever it is you love, your grief for whoever it is you've lost, your ongoing and improbable and entirely subjective decision that things still matter. But they do, to you. And that, just the fact of caring, just the fact of continuing, is the most philosophically significant thing in the infinite multiverse. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. One must imagine Rick Sanchez, somewhere in dimension C137, putting down the flask for a moment and looking at the people in the room. One must imagine the quiet in that garage before the next adventure, when for a few seconds nobody is saying anything, and the evening light is coming in through the window, and everything is exactly as insignificant and as irreplaceable as it has always been. Come watch TV. Thank you for being here. Thank you for thinking about these things with me tonight. If this video gave you something, a thought, a feeling, a question to carry with you into the week, then please consider subscribing to Caillou Pickle Rick. Every subscriber means we get to keep making these quiet spaces, these corners of the internet where the ideas can breathe, where we can slow down together and sit with the big questions without having to come up with final answers. Hit the like button if you want to. Leave a comment if you have something to say. And if you're here at the end of this, in whatever hour it is, ready for sleep, you went somewhere real tonight. The boulder will still be there in the morning, and that's okay.